Hey, welcome back, everyone. So today we're going to look at topic 6. Topic 6 is solving x squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Now this is a quadratic equation, and we're going to solve that using factoring. Now factoring is essentially just the opposite of FOIL. Okay? When we FOIL something, we take two binomials and we put them back together. Factoring is breaking things apart. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take trinomials and we're going to break them apart using this factoring. And when we solve quadratics, you need to try and factor. So we're going to start by factoring some expressions. Okay, expressions have no equal signs, so we're going to factor here and then move that over to equations. Now when we factor, what we're really doing is we're going to start by looking for a greatest common factor, which there is not one in this case. Okay, so we're going to take it and we're going to break it down into two binomials. Now the binomials are going to end up breaking down to where if I were to FOIL them, they come back to this part. So you got to think to yourself, what times itself, or what times what equals x squared, and it's an x and an x. Okay. Now we move on to the last term here, which is 20. So what I got to ask myself is, I need two numbers that I'm going to multiply to get 20. So two factors of 20 that eventually find a way to make 9. And since these are both addition, I want them to add up to 9. Okay. So factors of 20 are 1 and 20, 2 and 10, and 4 and 5. Well, the two there that add up to 9 would be 4 and 5. So I would have a 4 and 5 here, and I want them to add up to 9, so that means that I have to have a positive 4, a positive 5, and that is now factored. And we call that factored. Now that occurs when you have those two plus signs. Now we move on to problem B. Same basic idea. I've got my two sets of parentheses. Okay, what times what equals x squared? It's going to be an x times x. And now again, I want two things that multiply to 12. So two things that multiply to 12 are 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. Now in this case, I want them to add up to a negative 8. Well, if I look at these, the two things that would add up to a negative 8 would be 2 and 6, but not just 2 and 6, they'd have to be negative 2 and negative 6. So I've got a negative 2 here, a negative 6 there, oops, sorry, a negative 6 there, and those would then be your final answer. Okay? And you could always go back and FOIL these and check to see if they work and prove to yourself that you did this correctly. Now, coming back down to problem C. The difference in this problem is now you have a negative here. And what that means is, you guys remember in FOIL, when you do last, so this times this, those two things multiplied together have to give me a negative 15. Well, the only way to make a negative is to have opposite signs. So one being a positive, one being a negative. So we go through the same process. You have an x squared here. You got an x and an x. Two things that multiply to 15. Well, that's 1 and 15, and 3 and 5. Now, because this needs to be a negative, these have to be opposite signs. So I'm thinking negative 1, positive 15, or positive 1, negative 15. Negative 3, positive 5, positive 3, negative 5. They've got to be opposite signs. Well, for this middle one, I need them to add up to a negative 2. Well, if I make this a negative 3 and a positive 5, and I add those things together, I will get a positive 2. 5 plus a negative 3 is a positive 2. Negative 3 times a positive 5 is a negative 15. And those are my two terms. And a little trick is, whatever this sign happens to be, your larger number will be that sign. So if we have a positive and a negative, your bigger number will always be that sign. And in this case, the positive. Now over here on D, same basic idea. I've got my two sets of parentheses. You got an x and an x. Two things that multiply to 18. So I've got 1 and 18, 2 and 9, 3 and 6. And I've got to find the two that would add up to a negative 7. Well, we know they have to be opposites because it has to multiply to a negative 18. And the two that have a difference of 7 are 2 and 9. Now, since this is a negative, that means that my 9 is going to have to be negative, because a 2 plus a negative 9 gives me the negative 7. So I'm going to have a plus 2 and a minus 9. And there are my final answers. All right, what I'd like you guys to do is to take a couple minutes, pause the video, go through and try these 4. Okay, they're similar to the ones we just went through, but try those 4, and then we'll come back and give them a try in a second. All right, hopefully you guys have had a chance to give those a try. So let's see how you guys did. So we take these, We set up our two parentheses. D squared would be D and D. So two things that multiply to 24 add up to 11. So you can list out your numbers. So you got 1 and 24, 2 and 12, 3 and 8, 4 and 6. Well, the ones that add up to 11 are going to be 3 and 8, and it's positive 3 and positive 8. And there's your final. For F, we go about it the same way. So you've got a W. Okay, two things that multiply to 28 and add up to 11. Well, that's 1 and 28, 2 and 14. 3 doesn't work, 4 and 7. Well, the ones that add up to a negative 11 would be a negative 4 and a negative 7. And so there are your signs. Okay, coming down to G. You've got your X and your X. Right? Two things that multiply to 18 have a difference of 3. So 1 and 18, 2 and 9, 3 and 6. Well, I know they have to be opposite signs because this one's a negative. And they need to add up to positive 3. So the ones that have a difference of 3 are right here. And the bigger number gets that sign. So I've got a plus 6 and a negative 3. And there are my final answers. And then finally on this one, I set up my parentheses. You've got the X and the X. Okay, two things that multiply to 20. So you can make your list. 1 and 20, 2 and 10, 4 and 5. Now I need the two that have a difference of 1, and more specifically a negative 1. Well, this does not, this does not, this does, as long as that 5 is negative. So then you've got a positive 4 and a negative 5. And you can always go back and FOIL those to prove that they work. Okay, hopefully that clears some things up. Let's finish this up with this last part. Last thing is solving. Now, ZPP, in topic number 5, we talked about the zero product property, where two things can be multiplied together. The answer would have to be 0 if one of them is 0. We're going to use that same idea here. Now, I want to try and factor this. Well, if you notice, I can't factor it the way it is. I want to make sure that one side is equal to 0. So I'm going to start by subtracting 27 from both sides. So I've got x squared plus 6x minus 27 equals 0. Now I can factor. So I break it down just like the previous problems. You've got an x and an x. That's a negative, meaning our signs are going to be opposites. And so two things that multiply to 27 have a difference of 6. I can make my list. It works out that it's going to be 9 and 3. Now the 9 is going to be positive, the 3 is going to be negative. So positive 9 minus 3 is a positive 6. Now the zero product property said that I can take each of these, set it equal to 0, and solve. So I subtract 9, I get x equals a negative 9. I add 3, I get x equals positive 3, and those are your two answers. And you can prove they work by substituting them back in. So if I take my negative 9 and I substitute it back into my original problem, I get negative 9 squared, which is a positive 81, plus 6 times negative 9 is a negative 54, equals 27. That works. I can take my 3 and do the same thing. So 3 squared is 9, plus 6 times 3, which is 18, equals 27. That works. And there's your two answers, negative 9 and positive 3. Okay, take a second, pause the video, and try problem B. All right, welcome back. Final problem here. We're going to factor first. Okay, it's already equal to 0, so we just factored. So it gives you an x and an x. Because that's a negative, you got a plus and a minus. So two things that multiply to 18 add up to 3. Well, you've got, looking at your list, 1 and 18, 2 and 9, 3 and 6. 3 and 6 are the two answers. So you put a positive 6 and a negative 3. Multiply to a negative 18, add up to a positive 3. And now you set them equal to 0. So x plus 6 equals 0, x minus 3 equals 0, and solve. So subtract 6. This gives you x equals a negative 6. Add 3. You get x equals a positive 3. And there are your two answers You could plug them back in to prove that they work, and there you go. Okay, if you need any help, contact me online. Otherwise, good luck with your assignment.